And you guys put me through a window into a paddy wagon and took me to the hospital?
Yeah. You guys see that rocket this morning?
Oh yeah, did the launch chair go off?
They didn't find the king's hidden fortune in some glittering vault or high-security safe. It started with a dusty box and a name no one had spoken in years. For decades, the world believed the story was simple. The greatest star on earth died rich in fame, but poor in cash. Newspapers called it the price of excess. Biographers said he'd burned through his money on mansions, cars, and hangers-on. Fans shook their heads and whispered that even a king couldn't outrun bad choices. But that version of the story was only half true, because buried in a forgotten storage unit in the back of an old law firm's archive, someone finally opened a box that should have been destroyed. Inside, there weren't gold bars or diamonds, just paper, crumbling folders, yellowed envelopes, a leather notebook with the king's initials pressed into the spine. On the first page of that notebook, in his own looping handwriting, were 4 words that changed everything. Find what they stole. From that moment, the myth of the broke king began to crack. To understand why, you have to remember who he really was. On stage, he was a god in a spotlight. Crowds screaming, cameras flashing, money pouring in by the minute. Every tour broke records. Every album went platinum. At his peak, he was earning sums most people couldn't imagine in a lifetime, in a single weekend. But behind the curtain, things looked very different. He wasn't sitting at a desk going through statements and contracts. He was half asleep in limousines, signing stacks of paper pushed in front of him by people who said, "Don't worry, we've got you." Managers, advisors, family friends, they smiled. They praised him. They promised to protect him from the sharks, while quietly becoming sharks themselves. Inside the house, the family was already divided. One side believed every word the manager said. "He saved you," they told the king. "Without him, you'd have nothing." The other side saw the pattern, the tension over bills, the properties slipping away, the way the king flinched every time another unexpected tax problem appeared. But they weren't the ones with the keys to the safe or the passwords to the accounts. When he died, the official story spread faster than the truth ever had a chance to move. The estate was chaos, they said. Debts, lawsuits. The government wanted its share. Somehow, after all those years of sold-out shows, the king's fortune looked like smoke. Everyone had heard about it, but no one could touch it. His fans felt it in their gut. There was more money than the world was being told. Numbers leaked here and there, tour grosses, record sales, merchandise. But when those numbers were compared to what the estate reported, something didn't add up. Millions that should have been there had simply evaporated. For years, it was just a theory. A dark rumor floating around fan forums and late-night conversations. Someone had hidden the king's money. Someone had quietly built a second fortune, in his name, off his back, and then sealed it away where his own blood could never reach it. Decades later, that dusty archive box turned the rumor into a real investigation. The person who opened it wasn't a famous lawyer or a celebrity. They were a younger relative of the king, someone who had grown up in the shadow of the legend and in the shadow of all those unpaid questions. They'd heard the arguments, seen the resentment, watched their family fracture over money that never seemed to arrive. They were supposed to be cleaning up old records, closing down a long-retired attorney's practice. Most of the boxes were harmless. Old property sales, letters, fan mail. But one box was different. It was unmarked except for 3 letters, the king's initials. Inside were contracts no one in the family had ever seen, royalty statements no biographer had ever written about, and that leather notebook with the 4-word warning: As they flipped through the stack, a pattern started to appear. Numbers that didn't match the official estate files, royalties diverted to a company the family had never heard of, payments marked as offshore holding and temporary transfer. And then they saw it. On the last page of an old bank letter, printed in tiny, fading type at the bottom, was something no one had ever mentioned in public. The name of a foreign account tied directly to the King's touring company, and a note that said, "Beneficial owner, under sealed instruction." For the first time, someone in the King's own bloodline had hard proof that his missing fortune wasn't just a fan theory. It had a paper trail. It had a structure. It had a destination. What they didn't know yet was who had built that structure, how much money had been buried inside it, or why it had stayed untouched for so long. All they knew, standing over that dusty box in a silent office, was that the king hadn't been completely blind. He'd seen enough to leave breadcrumbs. And now, finally, someone had picked up the first one. By the time the king realized something was wrong, the machine around him was already too big to see through. On stage, he was untouchable. Off stage, he was a man shuffling from hotel to hotel, barely sleeping, signing whatever someone slid under his hand. Every flight, every limo ride, there was another folder. Just routine paperwork, they'd say. Tax forms, venue agreements, nothing for you to stress about. He'd sigh, scribble his name, and tell himself he'd look at it properly one day when things calmed down. That day never came. The person who made sure of that was always nearby, his manager, advisor, protector, the kind of man who smiled for the cameras and spoke for the king when he didn't want to. He took the calls, handled the money, and wrapped every answer in soothing words. "You focus on the art," he'd say. "Let me bleed for the business." But the blood wasn't his. At the height of the king's career, the numbers were staggering. Sold-out arenas across continents, records flying off shelves faster than factories could press them. Merchandise, films, TV appearances, licensing deals. The king's name alone could turn anything into gold. On paper, he should have been building a dynasty that would outlive him by 100 years. Instead, the people closest to him kept talking about cash flow problems. There was always a bill that couldn't wait, a tax deadline that had crept up, a property that suddenly wasn't performing and had to be sold. Whenever the king frowned at a sale, the manager would tilt his head and explain that it was just smart business. "You're rich, but you're not liquid. It's complicated. Trust me." Complicated was the perfect word, because that's exactly how they made it. Behind the king's back, company after company was created in his name. Holding companies, touring corporations, licensing entities. Each one added another layer between the money coming in and the money he actually saw. Contracts were rewritten so that the king wasn't paid directly from the shows or the records. Instead, the money flowed into these new entities first, and only then, after expenses and administrative fees, did a portion reach him. Those fees were where the real theft hid. On one contract, the king's cut dropped by just 3%. On another, 10% of touring net was redirected to management services. Somewhere else, overseas royalties were marked as deferred, then quietly reclassified as income for a company he'd never heard of. Each little change was small enough that, on its own, it didn't look like a crime. Put together across years and continents, it added up to something enormous. Inside the family, the strain began to show. The king would mention money worries, and some relatives would snap back, "How? You're the richest man we know." Others would glance at the manager and fall silent. Some defended him fiercely. "He's the only one keeping this together. Without him, you'd be bankrupt." The king had signed it weeks before he died. In simple language, it stated that if any such account was discovered that had been structured without his full understanding or direct oversight, its beneficial interest should default to his bloodline, not to any corporate partner, manager's company, or unrelated entity. The document was witnessed, notarized, and dated after most of the contracts the manager's side relied on. The investigator scanned the lines again and again, heart pounding. This was exactly the kind of original instruction the bank's letter had hinted at. They sent copies to the bank, this time through an attorney of their own. The tone changed. The next response was no longer polite and vague. It was careful, measured. The bank acknowledged that there was, in fact, a holding structure associated with the king's touring and licensing activities. It stated that due to the complexity of the arrangement and recent developments in the status of certain controlling parties, a review of beneficial ownership was underway. Recent developments, controlling parties. That was when the investigator learned something else the family didn't know. The manager, the man who had built the labyrinth, was dead. The companies he'd used still existed on paper, but some of the controlling interests had shifted. Others had gone dormant. One critical director position had never been reassigned. And buried inside the trust deed was a quiet bombshell. If the original controlling party died without designating a lawful successor, and if no valid competing claim was made by a certain deadline, the assets were to be distributed according to the latest valid will of the primary earner. The deadline had passed. Suddenly, the bank wasn't stonewalling. They were cautious. They scheduled a formal meeting at their headquarters. Representatives from the manager's estate were invited. So were the king's heirs. Lawyers on all sides cleared their calendars. In the weeks leading up to that meeting, the house was a minefield. Years of resentment detonated in whispers and slammed doors. Some family members begged the investigator to back off, terrified of lawsuits or more public scandal. Others urged them forward, fueled by a sense that this wasn't just about money. It was about proving the king hadn't simply blown it all. On the day of the meeting, both sides walked in with their own stacks of paper, each convinced they had the stronger claim. The manager's descendants carried old contracts and letters, insisting the king knew exactly what he'd signed. The investigator carried that quiet amendment, the king's last written attempt to claw back what had been taken. Everyone waited as the bank's senior official opened the file that would decide it. He read in silence for a long time, eyes moving from one set of documents to the other, then back again. Finally, he closed the folder, folded his hands and said, "This account has been dormant for years, but it is far from empty. And legally, it can't stay in limbo any longer." Then he turned to the king's family. "The question," he said, "is not whether a fortune exists. It's who the law says it belongs to now." The room went silent as the bank official adjusted his glasses and read the final line of the trust deed. For decades, people had whispered that the king's money had vanished. But the numbers on that page didn't look like vanished. They looked like victory. He cleared his throat and spoke slowly, as if each word might break the air. The account's current balance exceeds $400 million. $400 million. Not imaginary, not rumor, not fan fiction, real, untouched, growing quietly in the dark while the world believed the king died almost bankrupt. A sound broke from the manager's side of the table. A sharp inhale, a curse muttered under someone's breath. The king's family froze. One relative began to shake. Another whispered, he wasn't crazy. He knew. Because now, finally, the myth shattered. The king was never broke. He'd been robbed, and the money he'd tried to protect had survived the very people who tried to bury it. The bank official continued. Due to the death of the controlling party and the failure to designate a successor, the trust has defaulted to the instructions in the last valid testament. All eyes shifted to the envelope the investigator carried. The quiet amendment. The piece of paper the king signed in a moment of clarity and defiance, asking the world, just once, to listen to him instead of the voices surrounding him. The manager's descendants scrambled. They spread out their contracts, waving stamped pages, pointing to signatures forged in exhaustion. He agreed to these terms, one insisted. He knew what he signed, another argued. But every single document they held was older than the amendment. Every clause they relied on had been superseded. Every advantage they thought they controlled evaporated in a single quiet sentence the king wrote near the end of his life. The bank official didn't raise his voice. He simply stated the truth that had waited decades for daylight. Under this instruction, the entire balance reverts to his bloodline. The room broke. On the manager's side, rage, disbelief, and suddenly, fear. Years of power gone in an instant. The empire they tried to build on the king's back dissolved like smoke. On the king's side, shock, then grief, then something heavier, vindication. Not joy, not celebration. A deep, aching relief. The kind that comes from realizing someone you loved wasn't weak or irresponsible. He was fighting a battle no one saw. The investigator felt the weight of it most. They thought they were chasing money. But what they uncovered was truth. Truth that rewrote the king's story. Truth that proved he hadn't failed his family. The system had failed him. And someone he trusted had weaponized that system to drain him while telling him he was lucky to have them. In the weeks that followed, the legal transfer began. There were challenges, appeals, angry statements from the manager's heirs, but none of them mattered. The law was clear. The amendment was valid. And the king's last attempt to protect his legacy had finally landed where he wanted it to, in the hands of the people he believed in. But the family didn't rush out to buy mansions or cars. They sat with the reality of what had been stolen. Not money, but years. Years of watching the king struggle. Years of thinking he'd mismanaged his life. Years of blaming him for choices he never truly made. So when the funds finally arrived, they made a decision that surprised even them. A portion went to secure the family's future. A portion went to restore parts of the king's legacy that had been forgotten or distorted. And another portion, quietly, privately, went to causes the king had tried to support in life, but was always told he couldn't afford. In the end, the fortune didn't just change bank accounts, it changed the story. The world learned that the king wasn't a tragic figure who lost everything. He was a man who tried desperately to leave something behind. And though he didn't live to see it happen, someone finally followed his clues, lifted the stones, faced the enemies he couldn't, and brought his truth home. Some fans say the king's voice still echoes in that four-word note he left behind. Find what they stole. Now at last, it was found. And the people who stole it? They walked away with nothing but their own shadows. If you were in the king's family, what would you do with a fortune that was stolen for decades and finally returned? Would you keep it, share it, or use it to honor his legacy? Tell me in the comments and subscribe if you want the next untold chapter of this story.